Don't fade away when light shatters love in the dark, deep inside dreams of life.
What's up, Rovers? For many of us, patch 1.4 has been a very big day. Since the original beta, Camellya has been a fan favorite, and I know I've been waiting for a long time. The last of the OG characters that are probably on our side. Camellya hails from the Black Shores alongside other friendly faces like Shorekeeper, Alto, and Encore. Now, the wait was worth it because Camellya's an absolute powerhouse of a DPS that easily rivals top picks in every single game mode. She even got an upgraded model with much finer detail. It's safe to say Kuro definitely loves her just as much as we do. As always, all explanations and testing is backed by math, and my spreadsheets will be listed in description and pinned for cross-referencing. Today's guide has taken over 50 hours again to make, and it's starting to seem to be the usual. As a reminder, full team breakdowns have been moved to a separate video. This guide will still mention her best teammates and how the teams play, but nuances on gearing and rotations will be saved for the next video. We'll once again open with Camellya's team role and main mechanics, and then a deeper dive. Forte priorities come next, and then echo stuff. That's Mainstats, Substats, and Crownless vs Dreamless, and a little bit of lingering tunes discussion. Next comes weapon options, and then endgame stat goals alongside her sequences. Finally, we end with her rotations, and then a short summary of her team setups. Let's dive right in. So, you're interested in Camellya? Well, good thing, Rover, she's also interested in you. Camellya brings massive DPS to your team to keep you safe by quite literally destroying everything. Her main role is a hypercarry with limited capabilities for Quickswap, and in specific teams can be played as a dual carry. Because she requires a large amount of field time, dual carry rotations for her can get very complicated to keep team times down. I would strongly advise you to start off with Hypercarry or mild Quickswap sub-DPS variations, and save her complicated teams for when you become more familiar with her awkward cancels. These will be listed first in the team building section later. Camellya is competitive with the strongest DPSs in the game, going near equal due to her obscene and non-restrictive AoE. For traditional Hypercarry, she stands side by side even with the best GN rotations. Why is this? She has gargantuan self-buffs on her kit, massive AoE, is low maintenance, and is almost entirely basic damage, making it very easy to build her on stats. Her main drawback is limited aerial mobility and being an extremely selfish DPS that quite literally doesn't want you to swap off her bottom half rotation. Doing so throws away over 30% of her total DPS, instantly dropping her down to sub-DPS tier. So how does Camellya work? Her gameplay is simple, but also pretty wild. She throws herself everywhere, twirling and shooting out vines to ensnare and destroy her enemies. Her main highlight is aerial gameplay, with limited mobility. All of this power in a single button, literally. 90% of her kit is done by just holding down left mouse button and letting the attack string go through. Now, while Camellya can be very simple to play, this is because her entire kit works in the background beneath the hood. There are two super important things to know about Camellya. One, she needs her intro. Without it, she is quite literally incapable of doing DPS. The second is that her rotation is split into two halves. The first half you can do whatever you want in Quickswap. The second half is where all her damage comes from and has a buff that doubles her damage. You do not want to swap off her during this. It will remove her big damage buff and also terminate her long spins early. While certain moves on her kit can be swap cancelled, both variants of the long spins immediately end if you swap off. For Camellya to do big DPS, she needs her Forte bar. The only way to get this is with intro skill or casting her resonance skill when her concerto bar is already full. So you see why intro skill is so important to her? All normal attacks and their variants deplete her Forte bar. Each of these moves will grant her bonus concerto and alt energy. You will also get a crimson butt buff on your HUD as you drain your Forte, one stack for every 10% of the bar drained. It takes exactly one full Forte bar to charge your Concerto circle plus skill. When your Concerto is full, her skill icon turns pink. Now this is your DPS mode button, Ephemeral, which lets you enter budding mode. It's also her hardest hitting nuke on her kit, easily reaching several 100,000 Casting this has a 25 seconds cooldown, burns 70 of your Concerto, yes, Concerto meter, grants you a full Forte bar again, and grants you plus 50% final damage. It will also consume all Crimson Buds you made earlier and give you an extra 5% final damage each, so if you depleted your entire Forte bar, you will have gotten 10 buds, and 50 plus 50 is 100, meaning you now deal double damage. One big side effect though, all your basic attacks cannot give ult energy while in budding mode. So you got it? How do we actually use this? Well, you intro her and hold mouse 1 until you burn all your Forte. Then you press your skill and then press pink skill and go again. But what about her normal skill? Well, this is what's used to switch between white hair ground mode and red hair flying mode. Note that red hair mode does not deal more damage than white hair mode. However, red hair mode has a much bigger AoE spinning horizontally and thus for mobbing is extremely good. Both modes are viable for bossing and basically equal, so just use the one you prefer. And note that only white mode is able to quick swap and that red hair mode can only move around by dodging. Jumping in red hair mode will also swap back to white hair mode. If you're too far off the ground, red hair mode will burn stamina on every attack. So let's look at our Forte priorities next. If you only want to play red hair mode in traditional Hypercarry, you can ignore her normal attack tree, as that's all white hair damage. However, note that Quickswap and dual carry Camellya teams require her normal attack tree as well. Otherwise, all her red hair damage comes from her resonant skill tree, and it's generally the mode you use during the big DPS phase. This is by far the most important tree to level, and your Forte circuit is your second priority. It's your big nuke hit. It's also considered basic damage, which makes up 75 to 80% of her total DPS profile. In fact, every single move on her entire kit is considered basic damage, except her liberation. Her heavy attack also becomes basic damage when you get her inherent skill, Seedbed. While Camellya can ult every rotation, keep in mind it will be not affected by basic damage buffs like the entire rest of her kit. If you only play red hair mode, liberation is much more important than her normal attack tree. But if you're playing Quickswap or dual DPS, her normal attack tree is equal to liberation. Her intro skill is mostly irrelevant unless you have your S5, which turns both her intro and outro into a mini nuke. Still lost on how her Forte circuit functions? No worries, let's dig a little deeper. As we said earlier, Camellya needs a full Forte bar to function, and the only way to get this is with your intro or if you burn an already full Concerto bar with her pink skill. Obviously, we start with intro. Now, this is what I call the preparation phase in Camellya's rotation. You have no damage buffs, but you have a ton of utility buffs. Every single move on our kit can burn Forte bar, except intro, outro, and liberation. The bar holds 100 Crimson Pistols. Every 10 you burn grants 4 Concerto for free, and 1 Crimson Bud. This means burning your entire Forte bar gives 40 Concerto for free, and generates 10 Crimson Bud stacks. Intro already gives 10 Concerto, meaning now you only need to produce 50 Concerto manually by spamming her moves. The 10 Crimson Bud stacks are worth plus 5% final damage each when you use pink skill to enter DPS phase later. All moves that consume Forte bar will also benefit from a 2.5 times ult energy generation multiplier. When your Concerto bar is entirely full, a pink skill, Ephemeral, will be available, castable in the air with a 25 seconds cooldown. Casting this puts you in budding mode, not to be confused with blossom mode. Blossom mode is red hair mode. Budding mode is just activating passive buffs you get this little aura around you. Anyways, this will consume 70 Concerto and all Crimson Buds. You will not be able to generate more Crimson Buds in this mode, and all your moves will stop producing ult energy. However, it will refill your Forte bar to full and grant a 50% final damage buff with an extra 5% for each Crimson Bud consumed. Switching off Camellya, even momentarily, will completely remove this damage buff. Budding mode also ends when you empty your Forte bar. This is your DPS phase where you hit the enemy as hard as you can. You want to make sure all your team buffs are active during this mode as well, which is where Quickswap can be useful later. Camellya's Liberation is just a massive AoE nuke. Be careful with it, as cancelling her normal skill or Ephemeral with Liberation will prevent the skill or Ephemeral from hitting. It's weaker than her Forte circuit and is also the only thing on her kit not considered basic damage. Still a big hit, so you'll still want to cast it every rotation. It's worth about 15% of your total DPS and down to just 11% if Sanhua's outro is active. Its main purpose is providing 20 concertos so that you can cast Ephemeral sooner to enter DPS phase consistently. Now, Camellya's resonant skill tree is the entire moveset of Red Hair mode, or better known Blossom mode. Everything here is considered basic damage. It also includes the skill used to switch back and forth between white and red hair with a 4 seconds cooldown. This is where all your AoE DPS comes from, so make sure to level this tree. Holding down left mouse will go through the entire chain, including the extra long spin after the third move. Letting go of the mouse during Vining Waltz 3 or Blazing Waltz will automatically continue into Vining Waltz 4. However, if you swap off during Blazing Waltz, it will end early and not continue into Vining Waltz 4. The Slam. This tree also contains a special super fast dodge counter with massive DPS. You cannot move well in Red Hair mode, but you can dodge around to get to enemies, while skill can be used to enter and exit Blossom mode. Jump will also switch you back to White Hair mode without needing your skill cast. If you are not ground level, switching to another character while in Blossom mode will put them in the air. Keep this in mind for rotations. Being too high up will make Blossom mode moves consume stamina as well. Dodge cancelling the skill will instantly put you on the ground or instantly in the air, but this is normally not recommended due to being a team DPS loss. Camellya's normal attack tree contains all of her White Hair moves. As a reminder, this tree has equal single target DPS to the Red Hair tree. For bossing, use the one you're more comfortable with. Red Hair has the advantage of floating above many ground attacks, but lacks mobility. White Hair has a similar moveset. You poke a few times before launching into a vertical spin that can be extended by holding down left mouse before slamming down. The short version hits 5 times, whereas the long version hits 20 times as listed. Note that the Red Hair mode is listed differently, and Blazing Waltz lists the additional hits you get when holding down left mouse, not total hits. This means Red Hair mode hits 6 plus 19 equals 25 times total on the spin. The final slam in White Hair mode is automatically queued after the spin, except if you swap off. Now, White Hair mode has access to a really good gap closer in her heavy attack. This heavy attack is special because with her inherent skill Seedbed, it becomes basic damage. Heavy Pruning is super important in Quickswap teams because it replaces basic 1-2-3 in White Hair mode, and skips forward inside of basic 4's big spin, saving about 0.7 seconds, while still producing enough ult energy and concerto for preparation phase before casting Ephemeral. It also creates a new backswap move in her rotation because basic 1-2-3 each require their own inputs, whereas Heavy Pruning only requires a single input. Normally, you can only backswap basic 5's Slam, or skill cast into Red Hair if Pink skill isn't there. Heavy Pruning adds a third window essential to Quickswap Camellya teams to function smoothly. This is why dual carrying Quickswap Camellya teams always use White Hair mode in preparation phase. The dodge counter in White Hair mode is decent, but noticeably weaker than Red Hair mode. Camellya's intro is not important outside of granting her a full Forte bar. You do not have to level this much except if you have your S5, which massively buffs her intro and outro. Like Xiangli Yao, Camellya has a true DPS outro which only deals damage. You should be casting Ephemeral every rotation, so it should always be using the stronger outro version. Camellya's inherent skills are super important. Not only do they collectively give an unconditional 30% Havoc bonus, which is higher than any other unit so far, but it also turns her White Hair heavy attack into basic damage scaling. Super useful for quickswap and dual carry comps that use her heavy often. Her second inherent skill, Epiphyte, grants her partial hyper armor during her basic chains in both modes, basically whenever you're holding down mouse 1. Strong hits like Berengal Slam can still knock you away though. For minor nodes, Camellya brings 12% attack and 16% crit damage. This makes it a little bit harder to build good crit rate, but can be mostly patched up with Emerald of Genesis on a budget build. Echo set discussion time. There are two main options, Havoc set and Lingering Tunes. As you can see with her signature, it literally doesn't matter what set you pick or even what main stats you use. Having a single extra substat on just one of your 5 echoes is worth normally about 3% total damage. And for perspective, that's how small the gap is between our sets and main stats. To keep the long story short, Camellya gives herself so much damage percent with her signature and kit that attack percent and damage percent basically become equal. For perspective, all limited DPS with their signature and kit so far typically grant themselves 70 to 80 damage percent. Camellya grants herself 100, 30 from her inherent skills, 70 from her weapon. This comes with the caveat that Lingering Tunes only matches Havoc set if you don't swap off, meaning it isn't suitable for Quickswap or dual carry Camellya setups, but it means you have the freedom to choose if you play traditional Hypercarry. If you don't have her signature, then her kit still favors Havoc set 5 to 10%. Lingering Tunes is still very viable on other weapons for traditional Hypercarry Camellya, but I wouldn't recommend running 44111 Lingering Tunes if you can avoid it. Weapons that give main stat crit or a lot of basic percent as passives typically result in smaller damage loss across stats and main stats. As stated above, Echo main stats are mostly relevant if you're using her signature. Technically, Havoc attack is the best option on a Havoc set, and Double Havoc is the best on Lingering Tunes. Outside of her signature, Double Havoc is always the best in all scenarios, but the gap is so small it doesn't matter, so long as you're still at least using 43311 Havoc attack. For substats, Camellya is a traditional DPS, so you just go crits. Remaining rolls go into attack percent, and if you can't get it, basic percent is better than attack flat on her, due to being 75 to 80% basic damage. And for energy, well, refer to this next section. Let's talk about Camellya's energy economy. Her Liberation makes up 15% of her total DPS and 11% with Sanhua's outro active. Not being able to cast every rotation is a 5 to 7.5% total DPS loss. The 20 Concerto it gives is also extremely important for being able to cast Ephemeral to DPS phase sooner. So why am I talking about this? Because Camellya can use Dreamless or Crownless. If you have her signature, Dreamless is about 2 to 3% better than Crownless. If you don't have her signature, they're equal. Dreamless is simple and can be casted at end of rotation to deal damage and produce ult energy, but Crownless is a transformation echo that grants plus 12% Havoc damage on cast. It's a DPS loss to actually go through the full attacks with Crownless, so it's normally cancelled in a rotation, typically with dodge cancel plus liberation. Now this means Crownless gives 0 ult energy, and as a result, Crownless requires 125 VR on Camellya to ult every rotation. Dreamless, on the other hand, can get away with 115 to 120. Keep this in mind when farming echoes, otherwise the DPS parse between the two echoes is so small, so pick the one that has the better DPS substats. In true fashion, Camellya's weapon is her best in slot, by an impressive 16% when you remember how busted Emerald of Genesis is for a standard 5-star weapon. Crit main stats, super high innate attack, free ER roll, and general purpose attack percent passive. I guess Kura learned their lesson from Changli's signature. Ironically, Changli's signature is actually worse than Emerald on Camellya because she deals absolutely 0 skill damage. Red Spring carries a crazy 70% basic damage bonus that is easily activated by her kit, but 40% of this is so far locked to Camellya herself and cannot be used by any other DPS in the game. I'm talking about the when Concerto is consumed and Resonator does not leave field, grant plus 40% basic damage. This adds even more reason to not swap off during her big budding mode DPS phase. In other words, on not Camellya, this weapon loses most of its value and only differs from Emerald of Genesis by giving 30% basic damage instead of 12.8 ER. Most sword users cast their skills early, so EOG's attack percent buff condition isn't an issue either. For example, on Sanhua, Red Spring is only about 6 to 7% better than Emerald of Genesis, and same for Danjin. Up to you if you want to pull for such a specific weapon. Or maybe you're like me and Camellya was your wife since the beginning, so it wasn't even a question. Red Spring also refines scarily well for herself, going up to plus 140% basic damage and plus 24% attack, exceeding a net total 40% DPS gain like Jinhsi's Age of Harvest. Also, like mentioned earlier, how Lingering Tunes is super similar performance to Havoc set. Due to attack percent bonus being equal to damage percent on Camellya, this also means weapons on Lingering Tunes have basically identical performance to Havoc set. Even the massive stat stick signature is only 2% stronger on Lingering Tunes. For budget options, the new Somnoire Anchor is an extremely strong pick for Camellya as you get a max for fine one for free, so long as you complete all objectives. This is time limited, so please remember to do it before the patch ends. Even if you aren't going to use it for Camellya, it is an amazing 4-star weapon only beaten by the paid Battle Pass sword. Note that it only works on hypercarries for non-swap gameplay due to its passive as the only drawback. Otherwise, Looming Gloss refines extremely well because it grants basic damage percent as passive. Remember that Battle Pass weapons have abnormal refined scaling, typically tripling their passives instead of doubling. Do be aware though that Looming Gloss's low innate attack is its downfall at low refines, putting it below most other options, despite being a paid only weapon. Commando of Conviction consistently outperforms Lunar Cutter and most other 4-star swords, as they're literally the exact same sword but with a better attack percent passive. Now, the new Endless Collapse Sword added with Gacha is very viable and extremely strong at rank 1 due to very high raw attack, but refines very poorly. And this is because it has both an attack percent and ult energy passive with split scaling. Unfortunately, rank 1 versus rank 5 ult energy doesn't change gearing and rotations on Camellya. Also, remember that if you want an R5 sword, Somnoire Anchor is available this patch. For 3 stars, Sword of Night is the only viable option, so really just get the event sword Somnoire Anchor. Now, if you manage to achieve all that what we've discussed so far, then her endgame substats should look a little bit like this. Do keep in mind these are scaled to level 90 with maxed out Forte, so it can take some time to reach this. Camellya's sequences time. Let's go. You probably would be happy to know that her sequences are actually pretty strong in slightly different distribution of stat gains compared to normal. All math was done assuming R1 red springs. Note that all values are quoted in a vacuum and will be slightly diluted in a full team comp rotation. Her main stopping points are S2, S3, and S6. S1 is a 28% crit damage buff. It procs on her intro for 18 seconds once every 25, which is enough to cover her entire DPS window. It also grants hyper armor during ephemeral, and I'm sure you've been whacked out of it a few times by now that made you reset the run. This sequence loses value slightly with 5 times double crit echoes, but regardless, it is still slightly stronger than a normal S1, being worth 8.4% more damage even on a 5 times double crit setup. On the other hand, they gave her a fat S2. You get a multiplicative 120% additional damage on her big ephemeral hit. This is also an AoE skill that is also most likely buffed by Sanhua's big outro. And if you go to S6, you actually get to cast ephemeral twice per rotation. S2 is a 25% more damage over S1 and 1.35 times as strong as S0. Her S3 is also extremely strong, granting her liberation a multiplicative 50% additional damage, and plus 58% attack while in budding mode after you cast Ephemeral. 58% attack and total damage is worth about 70% crit damage or 35% crit rate. Enough said. S3 is 21.5% stronger than S2 and is 1.65 times as strong as S0. S4 is a general team buff that only buffs basic percent. Unfortunately, we don't really have any other good basic percent units except Jilcha, who is much harder to use with Camellya than Yinlin, and both of which also don't benefit each other much outside of raw damage. Regardless, S4 is a 7% improvement over S3 and 1.76 times as strong as S0. S5 gives massive buffs to your intro and outro, but in practice, because they only happen once per rotation and are unaffected by basic percent substats or Sanhua's outro, it loses a lot of value. Even in a vacuum, S5 is only a 5.9% damage over S4 and 1.87 times as strong as S0. The in-game description of her S6 is confusing, so please do refer to the summary instead. Basically, it lets you cast Ephemeral again, now called Perennial, once every 25 seconds, instead of swapping off at the end of your rotation after you filled your second Concerto bar. It will give you an astronomical total damage buff, give back half your Forte bar, and burn half your Concerto bar so that you can continue DPSing. It takes about another 5 seconds to finish the bonus rotation and works well for finishing fights off without having to reset team rotations, as well as an absolute massive DPS buff. It's a 30% increase over S5 and 2.42 times as strong as S0. Well, it's time to talk about Camellya's rotations. There are 2 variants, depending on ease of use and playstyle. The simplest is red hair only. You never swap off or during a rotation, you just do the entire thing in one go. Good for traditional hypercarry and playing on mobile. Your goal is to always intro on her, then dump her Forte as fast as possible to get into DPS phase, with full Concerto for Ephemeral, then unload max DPS and swap off. Ultimate will always be cast in preparation phase because it is considered a minor source of DPS so that you can use it to fill your Concerto sooner. The standard red hair only rotation takes 16 seconds to perform and involves immediately casting skill to go in the air. Liberation can be used to cancel the skill animation but is DPS neutral to do so. You can alternatively dodge cancel it to immediately go in air. Keep in mind both of these cancels mean you won't be getting any ult energy from skill cast. Liberation is also useful if you're using Crownless instead of Dreamless, who also needs a dodge cancel. Crownless can only be casted on the ground, and Camellya's Liberation conveniently forces her to the ground. You can also use Liberation to prematurely reset your dodge cancel on Crownless to save time, while also putting you on the ground if needed for white hair mode or swapping to other resonators. It is extremely hard to swap cancel Crownless without your next unit being in the air, so otherwise after holding your spin, your Forte should be empty and Concerto full. Cast Ephemeral and redo the spin. Remember to skill cast to white hair mode before you outro. In contrast, the dual carry or quickswap rotation takes 13 to 14 seconds and uses white hair for the preparation phase, and red hair for the DPS phase. White hair ensures your early swap-ins stay grounded to synergize better with team rotations. It also grants you an extra backswap window from heavy pruning. If you use white hair rotation, it is expected you backswap at least once on the heavy or basic 5 slam, otherwise you might as well just be using red hair mode. You intro in plus pre-hold to slam down and immediately set the heavy. Backswap is needed. Heavy takes 87 frames or 1.45 seconds to perform. You actually have about 1.7 seconds, which is after she despawns in the air, before swapping back puts her on the ground instead of continuing the aerial basic 4-hold spin. If you backswap Liberations here, make sure they have enough freeze time, as older units like Sanhua have minimal freeze time, and Camellya will fully despawn during the animation. If needed, you can backswap again at the apex of the spin with Camellya's sword flashes red to start the slam. This occurs about 10 frames in, with 71 more frames to go in the slam, saving you 1.2 seconds overall. Note that backswapping the slam will put you in the air. An extra backswap is available if you haven't reached pink skill yet. Otherwise, cast pink skill, do big AoE and hold spin until it's done. Then cast skill to swap back to white mode before outro, and if you're on Dreamless, cast it before going back to the white hair mode. Okay, team building time. As a reminder, the in-depth version of this will be in a separate video since it takes an enormous amount of time and team data for rotations to be done. If you want an early peek, I already refined all team rotations in the Camellya spreadsheet. Currently, only Verina teams are there, but Shorekeeper will be added later alongside the team building video. Shorekeeper is better suited to the traditional Hypercarry Camellya because her nodes give crit damage, so Shorekeeper can patch up the 70% crit rate on min-max builds to be more flexible. Verina is required for Quickswap because the goal of Quickswap Camellya is setting her up early alongside her supports and sub DPS, but she cannot set up her buffs without intro. Conversely, her best supports, such as Sanhua, must outro into Camellya to give her their big damage buffs, but they only last 14 seconds. Therefore, Verina also double intros Camellya to set up her buffs at the same time her sub DPS do her rotations. This also makes it easier for sub DPS to do their job because Camellya can outro into them for extra concerto and speeding rotations along, as Verina does not require intro like Shorekeeper. For dual carry, the flexibility to double intro Camellya or the second carry opens up a lot more possibilities in rotations to maximize DPS and minimize rotation times. I imagine the most common Camellya team will be a Verina Sanhua setup. Super fast rotations, massive damage, and quite simple to play. This has a traditional non-swap version and a quick-swap version. The quick-swap version shaves off about 2 seconds and results in 5 to 10% higher overall DPS, while also making Sanhua rotation deal 1 extra basic attack on swap-in for Concerto if you're not using Overture. The first shown rotation is a standard cookie-cutter non-swap. If you want an easier time and you feel you have already enough DPS, this works just fine for Camellya. For the Quickswap version, we will be backswapping the basic 5 into white hair mode because Sanhua needs to cast Liberation before skill, but her Liberation doesn't have time stop and thus cannot backswap Camellya's heavy pruning. I'm on S5 plus Emerald of Genesis for this particular Sanhua showcase. Note that S5 Sanhua produces an extra unlisted 15 Concerto when detonating her Liberation Glacier with her heavy attack. You can Liberation, skill, detonate into outro, or feeling fancy, Liberation and detonate and skill cancel the moment the first detonate hit lands to break the ice even faster. Otherwise, Crownless cancel with Liberation and go into Ephemeral DPS phase, and that's it. Another solid teammate for Camellya is Havoc Rover, who has access to his 6 seconds hyper burst rotation when at S2 or higher. This involves casting her normal skill on the opposite half of the rotation for extra concerto. Then you can use her S2 to reset skill cooldowns when going into Dark Surge state. Letting her get 3 skill casts off per rotation immediately lets her ult and Dreamless outro cancel. Rover needs 130 to 140 ER for this work. In the future though, her S4 will grant 10% Havoc Shred to the team. Danjin is another good teammate but requires more time to charge her concerto. Whereas Rover works like a Quickswap sub DPS, Danjin works more like a dual DPS. You'll have to weave in Danjin's combos during Camellya's heavy attack and basic 5. Also during normal skill cast, the team requires a lot of practice and you can really feel like you're bobbing and weaving. Jinhsi Camellya also works, but it is probably the hardest team possible for her. This team is extremely cancel dependent and involves juggling Jinhsi's incarnation and ordination buff timers for her dragon pukes. This team is strong enough to comfortably kill Scar in tower at S0, despite him resisting both Havoc and Spectral and getting 3 stars. Yinlin is a safe pick if you're already using or somehow don't have a Sanhua. She can completely fit in her quick combos for Concerto during Camellya's back swaps. I would not recommend using Jucha because her rotations are a lot more complicated with Camellya for charging Concerto than Yinlin. Finally, true dual DPS can be done with Yao and with Changli. Now, these teams are actually easier than the Jinhsi dual DPS, but generally still require a lot of practice. Thank you so much for watching through this entire video. I hope this Camellya guide has been useful for deciding on whether to pull on her banner. As a reminder, all spreadsheets documenting my testing can be found in the description and pinned comment. Do feel free to make a copy if you want to change values or test stuff. Cheers! If this is your first time watching, feel free to leave a like or better yet subscribe. You don't miss out on any of that, do you? Stick around if you want to see interesting videos. That'll be it for this one. Thank you all for watching and I'll see you all next time.